Well, hello there, and welcome to another tank review. I'm Corny Swiss, and today I'll be looking at the T-10, a rank 5 8.0 battle rating Russian heavy tank. Now, as with all reviews, the various portions of this video are going to be time stamped out, so feel free to skip ahead to a portion you want to watch. But if you want to hear the garage portion, let's get started. So the T-10 is kind of the final, it really represents kind of the end of Russian heavy tank sort of design. It's certainly the one of the caps of the IS line. And as a quick side note, the reason it's called the T-10 is that when Stalin died, this tank was just entering service. So instead of calling it the IS, which was the Joseph Stalin series of tanks, it was renamed to the T. So this was named the T-10. Previously, it would have been known as the IS-10, but it's also been known as the Object 730, the IS-8. It's had a lot of names, but in War Thunder, this is the T-10M. Now, the reason I said this is kind of the end of Russian heavy tanks is this tank was designed and brought into service in 1953. Well, it was designed from 1948 to 1952, but brought into service in 1953. Around that time, you start seeing nations moving away from the heavy tank as a design philosophy because it simply wasn't effective in the developing landscape for combat. You have tanks, the contemporaries or the direct competition for this tank are the M103 and the Conqueror. And those are the M103 is really the last American heavy tank prior to the implementation of tanks like the M60 and M1 Abrams and things like that. So this kind of is the end of the heavy tank, and it's kind of represented in that way in the game. This tank really behaves like just a very upscaled medium tank. The goal is to be quick, to centralize the armor to its most useful point, and try and keep up with the advance. And realistically, it does a very good job because this is a quick machine. It has a very powerful gun, but it does fall behind in a couple categories that are increasingly important when this tank was developed, designed, and put into service, and as it pertains to War Thunder in the 8.0 battle rating range. So, without further ado, let's talk a little bit more about the machine. Like I said, it's a rank 5 8.0 battle rating, 50 tons, 705 horsepower at 2100 RPM, for a max speed of 50 kilometers an hour. All that statistics there tell you that this tank is actually really mobile. This thing can move, and it can move quickly. And a lot of times, I have a suspicion that this tank might be if not the fastest, one of the fastest heavy tanks. It certainly is the fastest top speed. But it also just moves well. It has a grunt in the engine, and it can really get going in various directions. So that's part of where this medium heavy hybrid comes in, is this thing has pretty good mobility for a heavy tank. Now the flip side is that it is still technically a heavy tank, and it doesn't have as good as mobility as, say, a Leopard 1 or an M60, although it technically has a faster top speed. Now, moving on to more stats, the maximum inclination 40 degrees standard. 41 degrees is kind of standard for a tank this size, but 40 degrees is fine. Turret rotation 17 degrees a second. That's good. That's fine. A lot of the Leopard 1 and M60, I believe, well, the M60 has 24 degrees per second. I don't know. I can't remember what the Leo 1 has, but something in that ballpark as well. So it's a little slower, but it is also a much more heavily armored turret. Vertical guidance 4 degrees of gun depression, 15 degrees of elevation. The elevation is fine. The gun depression is a little weak. 4 degrees. That's pretty standard for kind of the Russian heavy tank world, especially a turret that's relatively low profile like this. Really not going to get much give out of for the gun depression. But 4 degrees is enough to get the job done. It means it's going to be difficult to take advantage of kind of hill hold down positions, but low rises and things like that are really going to be advantageous to this tank. So, since I've talked about being hold down, let's talk about the armor. So the armor on this tank is pretty interesting. In the front, we'll start with the hull, and from the ground up, you have this football field of a lower plate, 120 millimeters, 215 millimeters to 220 thanks to sloping. It is sloped back at 50 degrees. All right, well that's cool. You move on up to the upper glacis, and you have this section of armor, which is also 120 millimeters and sloped at 54 degrees. But thanks to kind of a double slope where it's sloped back and also sloped to the side to make this shuka effect here, this pike nose, you have effectively, let me reline it up, 240 millimeters out towards the shoulders where it gets out to about 270 on both sides. So that's pretty neat. It is also heavily sloped, so when you're pointing directly at the enemy, that sloping will help you a lot against traditional ordnance. Now, this bit up here where the driver's hatch is, technically 149 mil effective thickness of 150 millimeters, because it's only 40 millimeters thick, but it is also sloped back at 76 degrees, so that's going to be tough to penetrate. The 60 millimeter plate here that surrounds the driver's hatch, also sloped back at 76 degrees, 216 degrees of effective thickness, meaning that this section here is difficult to penetrate, and quite frankly, the easiest place to penetrate this tank frontally is right here, and I'll talk about why that's the best place to shoot in a moment. Moving on to the turret. Turret face is where you find the thickest armor on this tank, 250 millimeters, very respectable, and thanks to all the sloping and rounded and weirdness, it stays at about 300 millimeters all the way out to in excess of 500 millimeters. So the front of this turret, especially with this little mantlet right here, can be very difficult to penetrate. And you see this mantlet basically covers, I mean, look at that. You see all the red, and then you see the mantlet on top. So that's just an additional 130 millimeters of armor in addition to the 250 that already sits behind it. So the front turret of this tank is extraordinarily well armored, especially for what we see at this battle rating. Now, does that mean it can't be defeated? No. Heat FS can definitely get through this, and I've done it a few times. But a standard AP round from, say, an M103 or tanks of that like will not penetrate the front of this turret. It is very powerful. At least in my experience, it hasn't happened. Also, an advantage to talk about is the cupolas are really tiny, so that's not going to be a problem. And this armor up here is sloped back so ridiculously that good luck penetrating that. So, moving on to the side of the tank. Side of the turret, 170 millimeters. I mean, you're going to penetrate this usually if you get it in the side, but as you go higher up the tank, especially on this section here, it actually gets pretty thick. So you don't want to aim center mass on this turret. You want to aim a little bit below that, kind of on this seam closer to the turret ring, because you can see how the armor kind of flattens out. It kind of bulges out right here and then goes into this slope. So you really want to hit it at the base of the turret. Right, that's going to be where you have the best chance of penetrating. Up here, this is a place to go. 80 millimeters, effectively only 107, 41 degrees. But that is a smaller target, I feel. Hitting this, you have the chance of just sailing right over. If you aim here, the worst case scenario is it either goes low and hits the spaced armor, it hits the armor here, which is fine. Yeah, it's spaced. Well, it's not even necessarily spaced. Just armor on the side. It's difficult to tell what is spaced and what isn't. It doesn't look like that's spaced. So, hit this armor, right, and you'll probably penetrate. 120 millimeters, not tremendously well sloped, so you'll probably penetrate. If you go high, you'll hit this and you'll probably penetrate. So aiming center, like kind of lower part of the hull, this spot, I think gives you the best opportunity to penetrate, because you kind of bracket both good scenarios, and this is probably the best case scenario thanks to the layout of the turret. So, side of the hull armor, or side of the hull, 80 millimeters. It's got a little bit of sloping in there. Then you can kind of see it's kind of highlighted there how it's structured. It's almost like a V, so it is heavily sloped, and that might lead to bounces just because effective thickness, 200 millimeters. That's pretty good. Slope at 62 degrees. And also you have the tracks in here that might eat a shot. So generally aiming for the upper side of the hull is the best idea, because that's kind of iffy down there, especially with the tracks there. See, and it's illustrated pretty well here. You can kind of see how this bit right here works, and this is a much less slope, at least to me. 47 degrees versus 60 degrees. So aiming for the upper half of the side armor is the best bet. Now, rear of the tank, obviously it's going to be a little trash. 50 millimeters, 60 millimeters, 90 millimeters, basically all that. I mean, you're going to penetrate if you hit the rear of this tank. That's the same with just about every tank. So, that's the armor profile. Now, I mentioned this lower plate and why you should shoot there. If we bring up the X-ray, you can see why. Normally, one of the primary ways you get knocked out in this tank is either a Sabo or a Heat FS round penetrates this lower plate and just guts the tank from stem to stern. I've had a Heat round enter right in the middle, go clean through my driver, and kill a few crew members on the way out and just knock me out in one shot. The lower plate is a serious weakness that you do want to have covered as much as possible. A Sabo round will achieve a similar effect. So it's definitely a good idea to keep this lower plate covered by maybe a low rise and things like that. Because honestly, if this lower plate is covered, a lot of times a Sabo round, this will be enough to protect the sloping in here, is usually enough to protect against a lot of different shells. I haven't had as much, oddly enough, I haven't had a ton of success against times when I knew they were firing heat. The problem is it's very difficult in War Thunder to determine what shell they're firing at you. So I have had experiences where I've been able to go hull down, most of my hull covered, especially the lower plate, showing mostly just my turret, maybe just the top of my hull, and had some success bouncing shots and not taking any damage. Now it might have been that they were hitting kind of here, and just bouncing, or they're hitting the side of the turret and bouncing, whatever it was. Long range, close range, I have been able to achieve bounces off the front of this tank with this covered. But that's kind of a tall task because it's so big. Now, if you look at kind of the turret and the middle part of the hull, you'll see just ammo everywhere. I don't really think there's any reason to take shells out of this tank because it only has 30 to start with. And my indecisions with the ammunition kind of leads me to questioning what I should be using, I guess. So I a lot of times have a varied bag of ammunition for various different situations. Like if I'm on Kursk, I usually take more Sabo rounds than AP rounds just because I fully expect to be engaging targets at long range, so I use Sabo rounds. But I'll talk about that when I get to the gun and the ammunition. So I don't think it's worth taking any ammo out, and quite frankly, if they penetrate the front of your tank at this tier, you're probably dead anyway. So, not really anything to worry about there. You have the gunner, who's still called the aimer, on the right side of the turret. You have the commander behind him. You have the loader standing on the left, and the driver obviously sitting down in the front. In the shoulders of the tank and the sides, you do have ammo. You do have ammo on the other side. You have ammo boxes down in the middle and ammo in the back of the turret. And also in the base of the turret ring, you have more ammo. Obviously, all the engine, transmission, fuel tanks, radiator, all that stuff is all in the back half of the tank, starting from basically behind the turret on. So a penetration in this area will likely cause a fire. Interestingly enough, I have actually been penetrated in this section of the tank, kind of right in the top part by an APCR round or a Sabo round, and it did set everything on fire. So this back half of the tank, you definitely don't want to be showing to the enemy because it will be a problem. So that's the interior part of the tank. Let's talk about the gun since I alluded to it. Let's pull this up. Okay, so the gun. It's 122 millimeter, I'm sorry. 30 rounds of ammunition. With a decent crew, I have an 18.7 second reload. Now, when you first get this tank, you're going to start off with the BR-472 ammunition. This is a APC-BC round. And this is what I primarily fire out of this gun. It's a 25 kilogram shell, 950 meters per second muzzle velocity, and at a 0 angle of attack, at 10 meters you have 282 millimeters penetration, at 500 you have 262, at 1500 you have 230, and at 2000 you have 215 millimeters penetration. That penetration table is perfectly acceptable for an this AP shell. At that muzzle velocity, with that penetration table, I really don't feel bad about firing at targets. Now, There are situations where I have to switch and I need to use something else, but if you're careful about how you aim, this shell gets the job done 9 out of 10 times, on border of being 10 times out of 10 times, 10 out of 10 times, right? So this is generally what I use, and this is what you can tell I have it selected. This is the first shell that comes out of my barrel, unless there's a pressing need, or let's say I'm on Kursk, I'll load a bunch of these. This is a armor-piercing discarding sabot shell, 7.4 kilograms, 1,620 meters per second muzzle velocity. It's basically a laser pointer, so that's why I carry a bunch of it if I'm going to go into a situation where I expect to be engaging at range. Penetration at 0 degrees, 10 meters you have 328, at 500 meters you have 325, 1500 you have 307, and 2000 you have 290 millimeters penetration. So this thing will penetrate just about everything you see, actually everything you see, out till in excess of 2,000 meters. So there's really no reason to not. To me, this round is extraordinarily valuable in long-range situations because it's going to be really easy to get the round on target, and it's going to penetrate, right? At long ranges, you might come into situations where this doesn't penetrate. And I'm thinking of like very specific targets, like the front, like a mouse. You're going to struggle to penetrate a mouse at any type of range with this shell because your margin of error is so slight that it might become a problem. So this is a good shell to have around, right? And it's like I said, it's excellent in long-range situations. So on Kursk, for example, I'll carry a bunch of these. On other maps, I'll carry very few of these. Like on Kuban, for example, I generally won't carry very many of these. I'll probably carry maybe 5 just in case, That's just the type of player I am. I carry rounds just in case. So we come down to the Heat FS round. And this is, obviously it has the best penetration, but it's an 18 kilogram shell, 920 meters per second muzzle velocity. So it's similar to the AP shell in terms of muzzle velocity, a little bit slower, 30 meters per second slower. And it has 400 millimeters penetration at all ranges at a 0 angle of attack. So this heat shell, the thing about the heat shell, this is kind of just more in general, the heat shell will penetrate everything. There's been very few situations, and I can't think of any at the moment, that this heat shell did not penetrate and cause damage. It gets the job done. It's expensive as hell, though. Even the APCR, even the sabot shell is 980 lions. This is 1,200. It's very hard to run a profit with this. Now, the reason this isn't as important to me is because this shell here, in my experience, does a lot more damage when it penetrates, right? When this shell penetrates and goes off, it annihilates tanks. This shell, it's a heat shell, so it's generally going to have kind of a linear damage profile, maybe a little bit of a cone. And it's very dependent on where you hit the target. If you hit the target in a place where there's nothing critical, it's not going to cause any critical damage. If you hit this thing in a non-critical location, the shell's going to explode, and it could very well easily destroy critical components in the neighboring area. So, in my opinion, this type of shell just does a lot more damage on a more regular basis than this shell. Now, let's say you run into another T-10, which doesn't happen in realistic, but could happen in arcade. Firing this heat shell is perfectly adequate firing any of these shells is perfectly fine, except the heat shell. Or not the heat shell, the HE shell. Any of the previous mentioned shells, fired through the front of a T-10 in the lower plate is going to knock it out, in my experience. It's just a very easy place to shoot and cause serious damage. Maybe not the sabot shell, but usually it will. Now, the thing is why would you spend 1,200 lions when you can get the same effect here? And it's at a slower muzzle velocity, so it's not necessarily even more accurate. It's actually probably less accurate. This is a bigger, heavier shell, flying faster than this one, and causes a lot of damage. The only time where this shell, I think, really shines is against things like mouse, or targets at long range where the sabot shell isn't getting the job done, right? But this is kind of my go-to shell when I really need this penetration, and I don't care. And for example, I know I'm gonna face off against, I don't know, a mouse, and I need to penetrate the front of his turret, I'll switch to this. And the reason I'll do that is that I know if I hit the front of that turret with this thing, it's going to penetrate. It's going to have 400 millimeters penetration. It's going to go in. It's likely going to do some damage. This shell isn't as reliable against the front of like a mouse, for example. But the front of, let's say, I don't know, let's think of the competition, a Leo 1, for example, no problem, right? And you run into a lot of Leo 1s in this tank. M60s, the cupola is a weak spot, and you can penetrate and destroy M60s from the front. This heat round, you don't really need it, I guess, is the point. But it's a good thing to have around because it does fill that niche situation where this shell doesn't get the job done, and you need something with just buttloads of penetration. And this shell doesn't do enough damage up front. So I think heat generally does, in my opinion, heat does more damage than this. At least in my experience, the heat shells usually do more than the Sabo shells, but they all do less than this shell. So that's why I use it. And coming down to the HE shell, I mean, 27 kilogram, 865 meters per second muzzle velocity, 42 millimeters penetration. This is really only good against AAA trucks and knocking out guns. I don't use it, and I don't recommend using it because, I mean, like I said, every time, a high explosive shell, less than 152 millimeters caliber, and kind of in the later stages of this game, is just not worth it. Especially when I think this shell gets the job done against AAA or AA trucks and things like that just as well as this. So might as well just fire this, basically. So that's the ammunition. That's the gun. This is a large caliber gun for kind of these new age vehicles we have in the most recent patch. And it definitely brings the pain. The concern is this reload time, 18.7 seconds. I mean, the M60 and the Leo 1 boast reload times of 8 and I believe 10 seconds. Basically in that 10 to 8 second reload rate times. So this tank is going to fire much slower. A Leo, for example, could, in theory, if you fire at the same time and you don't kill them and they don't kill you, Leo could, in theory, fire at least 2 shots, maybe even a third, before you get your next shot off, assuming you're not getting back into cover. So rate of fire is a concern, right? But, you can make that work because this thing just has the outright stopping power to knock its competition out. So, quick overview. Armor means very little at this tier, but for what it's worth, the T-10 has decently effective armor. Front of the turret is heavily sloped and very good. If you can cover this lower plate, you stand the chance of surviving for some amount of time. Obviously, angling is not good because you're going to unangle this bit right here, and that's going to be easier to penetrate. So, not the best idea. If you can do it in such a way where this is very small, maybe side scraping, that might work, but you're going to have to be ready to accept pain through this opening right here. So, yeah. Armor, it's acceptable, but this tier isn't about armor, it's about speed. And this tank is certainly fast, but it isn't quite as mobile as its competition. In terms of mobility, I rank it third behind the Leo 1, the M60, and then this tank. So mobility means a ton at 8.0 battle rating. So that kind of hamstrings this machine overall. But the gun brings all the stopping power you need. 122 millimeters is kind of overkill at this tier, really. 105 is shown to be very effective with good rate of fire. This tank has a lower rate of fire, but it does just bring the pain. So, something to keep in mind. But without further ado, let's move on to the replay, shall we? So here we are in a realistic battle on the forest map I'll never be able to pronounce, but starts with an H. This is one of my early games in the T-10, once I had all the ammunition. And you can kind of tell from my loadout, I really didn't know what I was going to use, but I liked the look of the AP shell, so I brought a bunch of that. Now, the key thing that's different against a lot of tiers is that, well, it's really kind of what makes War Thunder tick. The biggest thing you can do is just not get shot at. It's the same thing in World of Tanks, same thing in World of Warships, same thing in every game like this. Not getting shot at is the number one way to live, and it's the number one way to keep your gun in the game, keep causing damage, and get lots of XP and credits and things like that. So especially at the 8.0 battle rating, it's important to be cautious. Now, the way to be cautious is to use your binoculars, is to do things like that. Also learn the maps and kind of learn where the enemy are going to be coming from. In this situation, I know the enemy should be coming from kind of my right, because that's where their spawn is, but I also want to be in a position to defend the cap. So I'm looking for kind of a overwatch position where I can monitor the tree line and see what's happening. But it's also important to keep in mind where your teammates are. You see I have a teammate moving across the location I was looking in. So I can assume that that's safe to move forward. And that T-54 looks like he spun out pretty hard. Coming through, you can see this tank does have some serious mobility once you get the engine rolling and get some momentum behind it. Now, pushing forward like this, I'm basically keeping in line with my team. You don't want to be in a situation where you lag behind or you're too far ahead, right? My team are engaging targets. I need to be up on the firing line with them, either helping disperse the enemy's fire so we're not one of us is always taking the damage, they can't focus their fire, but also use each other to some degree as distractions. That's kind of oxymoronic, but you get what I mean. It's important to present multiple targets to the enemy, and hopefully they don't pick you. Oh, that Leo was moving across the open, spotted him, and you see what I mean. All I had to do was hit the side of his tank, and he was going to explode. There's no... Oh, and there's another tank I just spotted down there. The nice thing about this AP shell is a lot of the 8.0 battle rating is dominated by Leo 1, M60, things like that, and most of the time, in my experience, is that usually this is whoever spots the other first and pulls trigger usually wins the engagement. So being kind of aware of your surroundings and being able to squeeze off that first shot is important. Now, with a tank like the T-10, you have basically guaranteed stopping power with this gun. You're either going to knock them out or you're going to cause serious damage to the interior part of their tank. So my goal here is to be kind of careful and gauge this tree line there, because they have to move across there to get to the cap. You know, they need to get to the cap. We own it, so I can be kind of aggressive because I know that they need to be on that side of the river. But I also can use the pings from my teammates to help me determine where the enemy are. And also I can use the dual machine guns on this thing to kind of cut down trees and things like that, which I'll do sometime later. But one of the biggest things is to always try and keep this tank safe, especially in the 8.0 battle rating. Because it's just far too easy for an enemy to kind of lie in wait and then peg you as you move across the open. So it's always important to keep in mind where your allies' shells are going. Kind of pay attention in that area. You can see I saw a shell go that way. I didn't see a kill feed message, so I'm assuming something's over there. But oh, there's a Panther down there, and oh, that's a Leo. I killed the Leo. I noticed the Panther down there as well. The Leo is probably the more dangerous target, so he's priority. His tank is fast enough where he could, in theory, just get out of dodge. This Panther is not going to be able to get out of here. I'm basically just going to kind of wait. My plan was to kind of side scrape up over here and then kind of come down a different way at him and try and catch him unawares. But ultimately, I see my ally moving across the open there, and that's going to distract the Panther. That's perfect time for me to dive down there and help my guy out, because we definitely don't want him shooting at my guy. He gets a shell off, but my first shell goes in and absolutely wrecks his tank. This guy is pretty much toast, so I just ram for good measure. But now I just have to wait for the reload. He's still burning. Spray him some machine gun. I was actually curious to see if that machine gun would actually penetrate the armor. It didn't. But the next shell goes clean through the side of his tank, kills his other two crew members, and we're all good. So, the disadvantage of that move, I really didn't need to charge down here, but I was already almost all the way over the hill. The awkward situation I find myself in now is that the enemy are definitely over there. I can see one right there. I believe it's a leopard based on the antennas that are poking up. And I'm going to try and clear some of this foliage to help me see, but there's a the Allied, I believe that's T-10, is moving up there. And someone just knocked out, looks like an IS-4, just knocked that out. So, should be toast. I kind of am a little cautious here, and I just say, you know what, I'm going to spray this tree line, cut down some of these trees, or try and at least get rid of some of them, just to make my life easier when it comes time to, if there's any enemies up there. It doesn't appear to be. We have an ally moving across the top, so that bodes well for pushing forward. So this is a point in the game where the enemy are routed. We're going to win. If the question is, can we kill the last of them? We were able to quickly capture the cap and then move down in force on their only route to get to the cap, which is in this river basin. And we basically caught them in the river basin and left them no avenue for escape. So, the big thing to take away is that because the T-10 has some mobility, it actually has pretty good mobility for a quote-unquote heavy tank, you can get this gun into good positions quickly. And that can be a big bonus to your team. This tank is generally going to excel in the more close quarter fights. Because although it's bigger and the armor doesn't necessarily protect you at close range, where the enemy can reliably hit weak spots or hit flatter surfaces or whatever, and when you're attacking and being in close quarters, it's more difficult to cover that lower plate. But taking all that aside, a lot of times the pure knockdown power of this gun can keep you going. Basically the 122 millimeter caliber gun, with basically every shell you need, with all the damage you can bring, puts this tank in a strong position in a brawling fight, because if you fire and they fire and you both penetrate, I mean, you both might be dead, but they are certainly dead. That Panther was kind of an exception, and I blame it on the fact that I hit his tracks. I think if I had aimed a little higher on the tank, or maybe into the side of the turret, he would have been knocked out immediately. So that's the end of this game. Let's move on to the next replay, shall we? So here we are in another realistic battle, this time on Kuban. And this is a domination mode, and I spawned in the northernmost spawn, so my goal is to kind of push towards B and help my team cap that and then sweep down towards A and C. The enemy already have a cap on C, so that's a little unfortunate. But Kuban is a map where the T-10 can actually really shine in certain situations. Now, the situation I'm going to put it in is not the best. Generally, you should never sit on high exposed ground, especially with this lower plate. You want to be in like a low little ridge where you can cover it. But I spotted some enemy tanks, and by God, I'm going to shoot them. Now, I'm not 100% sure what that is. I believe it's either an M46, maybe some type of tank like that. I don't think it's a T-30. It could be a T-32. First shell misses. He hits me twice, and both shells bounce. Leads me to believe it's probably not a T-32, but it could be. There is a T-32 that's going to be in that area, so it could have been him. But regardless, 2 shells, 2 bounces. And I'm going to change positions because that guy's seen me way too much, and I need to get into a more aggressive position to help my team cap B. We are pushing on C in the process of decapping it, and we hold A. So if we can push the enemy out of the B area, we're going to be in good shape for the rest of this game. Now, there's an enemy who's firing up there. We are losing some tanks. So I'm going to continue pushing forward, and that's when I spot a Leopard off to my right, who, nope, he just fired. He didn't see me. That's fine by me. Shell goes in the side of the turret. He's toast. No questions. Right. It's debatable if either of the other 2 shells would have necessarily killed him in that situation. Here's the T-32 I was mentioning. Oh, there he goes. Knocked out. Probably through the side of the turret, it looks like. Or maybe the side of the hull. I couldn't tell. But that's nice. That's basically the flank secure. But I was still, when I was playing, I was wondering if that was the guy I shot at earlier. And I was thinking to myself, I'm like, that wasn't a T-30, that wasn't a T-32 that was I was shooting at. That was something else. And basically confirms right here. Now, the grass makes it such that I can't really see him that well. Looks like an M46 or some tank of that nature. So I'm not necessarily scared of it. Just trying to find where it is through the grass. There he is. Put a shell through the base of the turret. M46, no problem. Now, my point is with the Sabo and the heat shell, I'm not sure that knocks him out. It definitely causes a ton of damage, and it definitely disables his tank, and it might kill him. But through the sides of the turret, I feel like you usually want some type of AP shell. You generally don't care about, because heat shells are kind of a cone, whereas the AP shell is just a big explosion inside the tank. And I'm not talking about the solid AP shot. I'm talking about these AP shots with the explosive damaging effect. They're just, if you can get one with good enough penetration, it's the best thing ever, in my opinion. It really is just the best shell available, just because it provides so much punch for what you're getting. Now, moving up here, and this is where I had a massive just freeze for some reason. I stopped driving because I'm like, whoa, what's happening? There we go. I don't know why that happened, but it generally doesn't happen. That's actually the first time it happened to me, and I was wondering, like, what the heck was that? I didn't actually even see that M60 there. Now I did. I was like, oh, shoot, that's the M60. Good thing he's not looking at me. Got the rear of his tank. Hello. Put a shell in. Penetrates his engine block, and you see the shrapnel keep going through the engine into the main part of the tank, and he just exploded thanks to his fuel tanks. But regardless, that was pretty nice. The nice thing about this tank is that a lot of heavy tanks have this problem where speed is an issue. Speed is not an issue for this tank. The problem it runs into is it's not as mobile as its competition, like the Leo 1 and the M60. But if you play properly and you play securely, yeah, securely, I guess, this is plenty of speed for what you need to do. Now, on big open maps where you need to get somewhere quickly, this tank is your best bet in my opinion, but it's certainly not the best at it. And I took that hit from over there, and I kind of angle my armor a little bit just because I'm going to be moving downhill. It's more likely he's going to hit the side of my tank. And I took a hit from somewhere up there that, yeah, I don't know where he was. And right now I'm kind of relying on, I'm hoping he fires a second shot so I can see him. But I really don't know. I think it was someone up there on the ridge. But, you know, it does annoy me that you can still get up there on that ridge. Because I don't think you should be able to. It makes the... my problem with doing that is, one, it's a weird place to be, and it's a place you probably shouldn't be. Because it just takes away all the cover advantage, so, like, you shouldn't be able to get up there, basically. That's what I'm saying. But, now, the enemy are capping C. I'm repairing my engine and stuff, so I'm not going to be able to make a huge difference on that. But we do have some bombers coming in. We're going to see a very nice bombing run by someone. Here he comes. I think you can see him on the map there. Yep, here he comes. Boink. A very pretty sight to behold, especially when it's an enemy receiving that bomb. But I guess I'll go ahead and kind of give a relatively high-level opinion of this tank. The opinion section's coming, but might as well talk about it. I think at the 8.0 battle rating, you have to value speed, and this tank is just not as mobile as the other options for other nations. So I actually think that this tank is probably my third choice behind the M60 being my first, the Leo being my second, and this being my third. I think it's materially better than like T-54s. I think it's materially better than the IS-4, simply because it boasts respectable armor, a powerful gun, and very good ammunition choices. It's also faster, so like that's a plus. And there are times when you feel like you're driving a heavy tank with the armor. It's just not that often. Gotta come up over here. I thought that was an enemy, but, I mean, he just got bombed. So, oh, there's a bullet hole in the back of his head. Oh well. I'll send one in anyway. Now, let's see. Now I need to turn this tank around. Oh, I just saw that. I was looking up there to see there's a plane, but I also saw a certain flak vehicle here. Whether he knows I'm coming or not doesn't matter. He's going to light me up a little bit, but it doesn't matter. Fire a shell right through the front, and he's dead. And that's going to be the end of my involvement with this game. So let's move on to the final opinion, shall we? Alright, so opinion time. What do I think of the T-10M? So the T-10, in my opinion, is kind of, I already kind of said it, it's the third tier for me in terms of the post-war tanks. I think the M60 is materially the best tank. The reason is it has a very potent 105mm gun, good rate of fire, good mobility, and from the front the armor is usable. I think the Leo 1 is second. It has probably the best mobility. It has a very powerful gun with an excellent rate of fire. It's 105mm, excellent rate of fire, great gun, same ammunition choices as the M60, but it has no armor. And the reason I say that the M60 gets a better rating for me is that the front armor is actually decent. So even if you do have the cupola as a weak spot, it still can survive a hit, and the mobility is good enough. So that's why I rate the M60 higher. Even if its top speed isn't that good, it's still mobile, still has a lot of grunt in the engine, still gets the job done really well. The T-10 is third, and the reason the T-10 is third is one of the biggest gripes I have against it is that the rate of fire. It's a 122mm gun, so the rate of fire is going to be slower. But the fact that it's that much slower is kind of an issue when I think of these tanks going against each other. Now, it does have the knockdown punch. It has that one-hit punch that the others might struggle to deliver every once in a while. But this tank, it has a good top speed, it has good maneuverability and all that, but it still is a heavy tank. And the problem you run into is that if the enemy are firing heat FS, there's no armor in the game that's going to save you. Right, you're going to get penetrated. And if this tank gets penetrated from the front, it causes big problems. Through the lower plate, just guts you. Even through the front of the turret can be a problem. So this tank isn't armor isn't. Basically, I'm struggling to say it, but I hope my point is getting across. Where the armor isn't good enough to justify. It's kind of the armor. The front of the armor isn't good enough to beat out those other two tanks for me. Speed is fine. The armor is decent. The gun packs that punch, but the other tanks aren't slouches when it comes to the gun and things like that. And also, the Leo is incredibly sneaky. It can get places in a hurry, and the rate of fire can really be a big difference in a lot of engagements, especially at long range. Also, I don't think you're going to be circling tanks very well in a T-10. Right, Leo and M60, they can circle pretty well. So, to me, this tank is kind of the third one, but it's important to understand that these ratings are all fairly close together. It's like if the M60 to me is a 10 of 10. The Leo is like a 9 of 10, or is probably actually a 9 of 10 or a 9.5 of 10. And this tank is like an 8 of 10, right? We're dealing with a pretty tight grouping here. And the T-10 is certainly in no way, shape, or form a bad tank. At the 8.0 battle rating, this tank is perfectly usable, perfectly acceptable, and will hold its own against its opponents. I prefer the M60 or the Leo 1 over it, but this tank is perfectly fine and is a very good way to cap off the heavy tank line. Now, that being said, I think all these tanks need to be moved to their own battle rating, but I think this tank is good. Nothing needs to be changed about it. I think it's effective. I love the AP shell on it. It just I feel better with those other two. But like I said, it's like a 9 of 10. Or it's like 10 of 10, 9.5 of 10, 8 of 10. Eventually at some point they're all just good tanks. And I think all three of the new 8.0 battle rating tanks are good tanks. This just so happens to be the one I enjoyed the least. But I still had fun playing it. I still, was able to have a lot of success with the tank, and it's certainly a good machine. So definitely worth the grind for, is basically what I'm saying. It's like if you're grinding along and you get to your IS4 and you're thinking, do I want to go to the T10? Yeah, I mean, why not? It's easily the most effective 8.0 battle rating heavy tank, in my opinion. I think it can outperform the M103 fairly effectively, mainly because of the ammunition choices. But and also I think the armor profile is a little better on this tank. But yeah, I haven't really run into that many M103. It's mostly M60, Leo 1. You kind of saw that in the replays. A lot of times it's a Leo 1 or an M60. So against those tanks, this thing fares fine. It has knockdown punch, and if you play properly, you don't usually get shot at. So if you don't get shot at, it's very difficult to get knocked out. But the kind of where this tank sort of loses ground for me, it's kind of difficult to be sneaky in a T10. It just is. It's just not that sneaky, really, a lot of times, whereas the Leo 1 is like ultra sneaky. But anyway, this is a good tank. Seal of approval, whatever. It's a good tank. It's definitely deserving of its battle rating, and it's definitely worthy competition of an M60 and a Leo 1. There are tanks that were introduced, when they were introduced, were just no way, shape, or form good at their battle rating and need to have their battle rating brought down. This tank is one of those ones where I say it can go up. This tank can be one of the 9.0 battle rating tanks, where it's all the post-war tanks like M60, Leo 1, T-10, things like that. When the British come in, if we get like the Conqueror, I think the Conqueror will be there. We'll probably have like some type of late model Centurion or something. When the British tanks eventually get here, that'll be up there. So it's a really good tank. You shouldn't feel bad if you're trying to get this. And I hope this review was able to kind of show you maybe some things to do to help make this tank effective for you. So that's it for this review. Hope you enjoyed. Hope you learned something. Hope it was helpful. If you have any suggestions for future reviews, I encourage you to leave them in the comments section. If you have any questions or concerns, or maybe just things I got wrong, because I do occasionally get things wrong. I will apologize for the audio sync problem that I think happened in the last replay, but I'll have to go back and check. But regardless, thank you for watching. I've been Corny Swiss. I'll see you next time.